My name is Phil Cutting, and I live in Newbury, which has a history dating back centuries. Now, I'm not an expert, but I'd really like to find out the stories behind some of the people who've lived here. Take Jack of Newbury, for example. Was he a real person? What made him so famous? And what happened to him in the end?
Here we are outside the well-known home of local legend Jack of Newbury. When he built it during the reign of Tudor King Henry VIII, this building used to stretch right down to what is now Victoria Park and all the way to the end of Marks and Spencer. Jack of Newbury wasn't his real name, it was John Winchcombe. It's rumoured that he ran England's first factory here, making cloth on an industrial scale.
The legend of Jack of Newbury comes from a book written 50 years later by a man called Thomas Deloney. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare and, sadly, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So although the book may have been based on the truth, there are so many inconsistencies that we have to take everything with a pinch of salt. What really complicates things is that there were at least 4 John Winchcombes. It used to be thought that Jack of Newbury was really John Winchcombe I, but the evidence now seems to suggest that it was his son, John Winchcombe II. To be honest, after reading the book online, it seems to me that Thomas Deloney merged the life stories of both men to produce a fictional character loosely based on the facts. But then, I'm no expert. That being said, what do we know about John Winchcombe II? He was the one who really developed the textile business in Newbury.
You could say that he was the Ralph Lauren or the Burberry of his time, because his fabrics, called kerseys, were highly prized.
Most of them were sent to London for onward forwarding to Antwerp, where they were traded across the world.
He was a clothier, the person who coordinated the whole textile business from fleece to market. Since England's wealth at the time was built on wool, every town across the whole of the country had its own local clothiers who grew very rich from the wool trade. But even by the standards of the time, John Winchcombe was considered exceptional. It's said that Winchcombe was important enough to be visited by the king, and that he even raised a small army and travelled to fight in France. He was considered influential too. Records show that when clothiers from 6 counties sent a petition to the king for a change in the law, they chose John Winchcombe to lead it.
The king, of course, was Henry VIII, whose life was pretty much contemporary with John Winchcombe. The king was responsible for great changes in England, and one particular change brought great benefit to those with money.
John Winchcombe lived during the period of the Reformation, when Henry VIII was closing religious institutions and stripping them of their lands. These were then sold to finance Henry's many wars with the French and the Scots. With his enormous wealth, John was able to buy the village of Bucklebury that Henry VIII had confiscated from Reading Abbey, and his son built a beautiful manor house there.
However, our John II continued to live in Newbury, growing in prosperity and influence. Everything seemed to be going well, until the king died and the politics all changed.
Being an MP and a figure of substance in the area can lead to some very difficult situations. After carefully negotiating the political minefield that was the reign of Henry VIII, John Winchcombe had to cope with the turbulent reign of Queen Mary. She restored Catholicism as the state religion of England. Across the land, those who promoted Protestant beliefs were ordered to recant. To refuse was considered an act of treason, and the punishment for treason was execution. Records of the time name nearly 300 people across England that were burned at the stake for standing firm for their convictions. 3 of those martyrs were tried at Newbury, and John Winchcombe played a part. Transcripts of the trial reveal him to have had a compassionate attitude to the accused when he remonstrated with the young Julian's Palmer. Take pity on thy golden years and pleasant flowers of lusty youth before it is too late, he said. Sir, was the young martyr's reply, I long for those springing flowers that shall never fade away. We'll never know exactly what Winchcombe's opinions were, but no doubt this event disturbed him as much as anyone else. Despite his pleading with the young man, Julian's Palmer refused to recant and was executed along with his 2 colleagues. The following year, aged 68 or 69, John Winchcombe died in his house in Newbury.
His death signalled a change in the fortunes of the Winchcombe family. The wool trade in southern England declined, and sadly his grandson, the last John Winchcombe, died very young. The Bucklebury estate passed to other branches of the Winchcombe family through daughters and nieces, who married other great landowners. But while the names changed frequently over the next centuries, the residents of the manor were all still descendants of John Winchcombe. In 1832 there was a disaster. Bucklebury Manor burned to the ground, and for over 100 years it lay in ruins. Then, in 1957, new members of the family began the task of restoring it. Today the building is called Bucklebury House, and many of the old 16th century farm buildings still survive, looking pretty much as they did when John Winchcombe III had them built.
So, whatever did happen to Jack of Newbury? Well, John Winchcombe II died in 1557 with the reputation, according to Thomas Deloney, of being a compassionate man who gave gifts to the poor. He was buried in St Nicholas Church. But his direct descendants are the Hartley Russells, and Willie Hartley Russell, who's a trustee of the Donington Almshouses and works with charities across the country, still cares for the estates that belonged to his great ancestor Jack of Newbury 600 years ago.